All right, so next we are in the Taisho era. And so we just got done looking at like the first couple of conflicts that Japan engaged with in terms of their like the first stages of imperialism. Now we're going to look at this next era. So we have the Meiji era. Now we have the Taisho era. So the Meiji era came to an end when the emperor died in 1911, and so his son comes in, and this prince, he takes up the name of Emperor Taisho, right? So they gave him this, and this is like the start of the Taisho era. On the surface, Japan seemed like it was going to become a successful modern empire with a new constitution, a democracy, and all of these things. But when you really look behind the curtains of what's happening, it is extremely repressive. And the reason why I say this is because all of these progressive ideas are being shut down. Most of the power rested in on the emperor and his inner smaller circle, and they're the ones who are making the decisions. And that's not really necessarily a democracy because people aren't being um, invited. The population is not allowed to have a say in what happens, right? Freedom of expression was very limited. Anyone who spoke of a left wing ideology like socialism was shut down, and the demands for equality for women were also suppressed. And, you know, racial minorities within Japan were also being suppressed as well, right? So, not really towards the pathway of a successful like modern like open democratic country, right? World War I begins during the Taisho era, um, and because Japan had an alliance with the British, the Anglo-Japanese alliance that we mentioned in the last lecture, Japan declared war on Germany in 1914. The Allies had asked Japan to contribute like military men and all that stuff to send them towards Europe. And yeah, like Japan did send like a few destroyers here and there, but like nothing that would actually shift the tides in Europe, right? Instead, Japan was like, hey, you know what? While you guys are over there in Europe fighting, your enemies over there, what if I fight Germany right here? And you can say, like, how are they going to fight that? Like, Asia is all the way on one side of the world while Europe is all the way across, right? It's very lengthy way towards over there, right? So the reason why is because Germany had a lot of territories in Asia, in the Asian Pacific, right? That China leased out to them. And so picking a fight with Germany and Asia was smart on Japan's behalf because one, they can claim those territories that they beat out of Germany, right? Two, those territories have a lot of resources. And so it was in the best interest of Japan to be like, yeah, I can fight this, right? Because then they can just take these territories, right? Japan was able to take multiple of their territories away because Germany, did not put up much of a fight. Most of their fighting was concentrated in Europe. But in that, it did end up helping the ally powers that Japan was disrupting Germany in Asia because a lot of the resources that the German military needed was coming from Asia. And since Japan is basically fighting them and taking these territories away from Germany, it disrupted a lot of what, not like a lot, but enough for Germany to like, hey, I need these things now. I don't have them, right? So this was an easy victory and installed again, once again, nationalistic pride within the Japanese population of like, oh my God, we're so good at this, right? In 1915, Japan attempts to force 21 demands on China, basically saying, hey, um, we just beat out the Germans and all those like territories that you gave, like that you leased out to Germany, we want them. That's ours. And so that's one of the demands. Another demand was Japanese interest in Manchuria should be recognized by China, so the railway specifically, and all the little cities and whatever ports are along the way. And Japan be given an increased role in policing and controlling China. And you can say that's a little weird, but like Japan basically was using this as a way to further gain more territory down the line, which we'll see that happening. Um, and the excuse was like, "Oh, you guys are too unstable," and that is like, a risk for our interest, and so that's why we need you to let us control you. This reflected Japan's ambition and strength and cockiness, right? Like they're feeling very, um, how do I say this? They're feeling very confident in that they can ask for these things and they'll get them because they beat China and they beat Russia and they helped beat Germany, right? And so all of these things is leading to Japan saying, yeah, I want this, this, and this, right? Um, and so China was unable to fight against these demands because they, like I told you guys in the last video, they are going through their own stuff. There's a lot of they're not very stable at this moment in time, and there's a lot of internal fighting, and warlordism made the country very weak and unable to kind of resist any outside powers from coming in and basically grabbing what they wanted, right? So everybody's taking a little slice of China. The US and the British attempt to help China resist. Why? Because the US was becoming very suspicious of Japan's desires to have control over China. Why would the US be suspicious? Because the US has special interest in some of the things and the resources and the influence and power in those regions. And if Japan comes in and oversteps their boundaries, that could put at risk the US's special interest that they have, right? So these 21 demands end up causing a lot of anti-Japanese feelings in China. People in China are obviously upset. I think anybody seeing a foreign power come in and give them a list of demands of what they want would upset anybody. So you see Chinese nationalism rise up. One of the things that's rising up at this time as well is the communist, right? The communist movement in China. So we'll see that later on and how all of that kind of comes together. Um, on May 4th, 1919, Japanese citizens protested against the demands placed by China as it violated their right to self-determination, which means just self-govern, right? Like we are our own government, we are our own people. There's no reason why a different government should be coming in and telling us what to do, right? So World War I ends on November 1918, and it was followed by the Paris Peace Conference, where negotiations were being held to decide who gets what, right? Naturally, Japan is saying, yeah, we helped out, so naturally we should get things as well. You see this as well with Italy, which we'll look at later on, right? Because this whole move to global war includes Japan, Italy, and Germany. Japan's demands were to obtain the German colonies in the North Pacific. So all these like little islands that Germany used to have, hey, naturally those are ours because we kicked them, right? We kicked their butt. US President Woodrow Wilson made the decision to give Japan Shandong province, but outside of that, they were not really given much as a reward for their help in World War One. They were given this because the US was afraid that Japan might leave the conference and not sign the Treaty of Versailles, the peace treaty that would officially end the war and place the guilt on Germany. This decision not to give other territories to Japan was influenced by the establishment of the League of Nations, as it could start up tension between members of the League. So basically, let's walk on thin ice with this, because any movement of who gets what, and this includes Japan, might kind of make everything fall apart. This new organization of world powers established to keep world peace rather than to fight wars. Japanese government was critical of the League of Nations, as they believed that the League was only established to preserve the economic and political supremacy of Western powers. Japan also pointed out the racist attitudes that were being held in the meeting. So basically, they were calling out names, and they're saying they weren't even filtering themselves. Hey, you British people in the US, y'all are being racist towards us, and you're not viewing us, the Japanese, as a power that is equal to you guys. You're seeing us as a second class power, despite the fact that their military did help out during World War One, right? The Japanese were very offended by the treatments, and obviously the treaties, right, of Japanese immigrants in the U.S. And we'll see that kind of play out to be true in the U.S. when you start seeing World War II and what the United States does to the Japanese population in the U.S. But that's again later on down the line. Japan called out the League for to support racial equality. This proposal made and called for equality of all races and religion in 1919. This was considered a controversial proposal. Remember, racism is like super alive, right? And people aren't really filtering themselves out. Um, it was very controversial, as it threatened European control over their colonies in Africa and Asia and threatened Australia's whites only immigration policy. So the idea of calling this out and saying, hey, what if we are not racist and what if we kind of treat everybody as equal, would mean that the United States, but like I said, the British and France, who have all of these colonies in Africa, they would have to give them up, right? And all of these like segregation laws and Jim Crow laws that exist in the United States would also have to be called out, right? Obviously, Japan lost this debate. The racial equality clause was pushed away, and like, nope, nope, nope. After the Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles was over, the Washington Conference of 1922 from 21 to 22 began. This conference described the new international order of protecting U.S. and British interests globally. The outcome of the conference were done to protect U.S. interests. This ended the Anglo-Japanese alliance, thus ending Japan's control over Shandong. It required the withdrawal of Japanese troops in Siberia. It imposed a 5-5-3 ratio in battleships between the British, U.S., and Japan, meaning Japan could never have more battleships than the US and the British, limiting their size, limiting their power and strength, meaning that Japan, if they abide by these rules, would never be able to tackle on the British or the US because they have more ships than Japan, right? The Nine Power Treaty eliminated all existing treaties between China and other powers, and it replaced it with the open door policies controlled by the US. 1930, limits on Japan heavy cruisers and destroyers were placed. This was a period of disarmament, basically, which heavily limited Japan's imperialistic ambitions. So their plans for spreading out of Japan and kind of taking all these territories was, they're hitting a roadblock at this point because of all of this armament, like movement, right? This disarmament made the Japanese ultranationalists super unhappy, so much so that the right-wing militants resorted to assassinating members who signed these treaties. And we're going to see a lot more assassinations happening down the line. It's going to get very intense very fast. And that's it.